Hello everybody, this is Lohita. We are here into another class of Neet Zoology. We are actually discussing the topic human physiology. We are into the topic human physiology. In that topic we are discussing regarding neural control and coordination chapter. So we are into the chapter neural control and coordination. We have already discussed few concepts related to neural control and coordination. So here in this class we are going to discuss regarding the topic transmission of nerve impulse. So we have already discussed in our earlier class about the conduction of nerve impulse. So in today's class we are going to learn how the nerve impulses are transmitted from one neuron to the other neuron. Okay, so the nerve impulses are transmitted from one neuron into the other neuron through some junctions which are called as synapses. Okay, through some junctions called synapses. The nerve impulses are transmitted from one neuron to the other neuron. Okay, so the nerve impulses are transmitted from one neuron to the other neuron through the junctions called synapses. So what does a synapse contain? What is the synapse? A synapse is actually formed by a membrane from the presynaptic neuron and a membrane from a postsynaptic neuron. I'll just draw a rough diagram which is showing the synapse between two neurons. I'll just simply draw a rough diagram showing the two neurons. Okay, so if this is one neuron and we have the other neuron. Okay, this is the other neuron. So we have two neurons. So the impulses will be traveling from one neuron to the next neuron through some junctions called synapses. So this synapse is formed between, this is the presynaptic neuron and this one would be the postsynaptic neuron. Between these two neurons, the synapse is formed. Between the axon terminal of the first neuron, that means the presynaptic neuron, and here will be the dendrites, isn't it? So the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron, the synapse is formed. Okay, between the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron and the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron, the synapse is formed. And what does a synapse contain? A synapse contains the membranes of the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, I'll just show you in the diagram. So here is the axon terminal. This is the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron and this is the membrane of the postsynaptic neuron. So between the membranes of the presynaptic neuron, that is the presynaptic membrane, and the postsynaptic neuron's postsynaptic membrane, these two membranes which are separated by a gap called synaptic cleft. So these three together form the synapse. What form a synapse? The presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane which are separated by a gap called synaptic cleft will form a synapse. Okay, so this part is clear. We have seen that this is the postsynaptic neuron and presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. Between these two neurons, the synapse is forming. And let us look into this diagram. I have just drawn this part of the diagram and I am showing it here. Okay. So once again coming back to the concept of synapse. A synapse is formed by the membrane of the presynaptic neuron, that is the presynaptic membrane, and the membrane of the postsynaptic neuron, that is the postsynaptic membrane. So the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane which are separated by a gap called synaptic cleft. So all these three together, the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane which are separated by a gap called synaptic cleft will form the synapse. Okay, so what is a synapse now? A synapse is the connection. It is a connection between the two neurons through which the nerve impulses will be traveling. And what does a synapse contain? A synapse contains a presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane which are separated by a gap called as synaptic cleft. They are separated by a gap called as synaptic cleft. This is about the synapse. And actually there are two different types of synapses, students. There are two types of synapses. Let us discuss what are the types of synapse now. There are two types of synapses. The first one is electrical synapse other one is chemical synapse. Okay, so we learned regarding the synapse. I am erasing this. Now we are moving into the types of synapses. There are two different types of synapses. They are the electrical synapse and the chemical synapse. Okay, so first we will discuss regarding the first type of synapse, electrical synapse. Okay, so we are now going to discuss regarding the electrical synapse. So in the electrical synapse, there is no much gap between the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane. Students, whatever the diagram I have drawn here is the diagram showing the chemical synapse. When coming to the electrical synapse, the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane, they are very close to each other. There is no synaptic cleft. They are not separated. The presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane, they are very close to each other. Okay. Here in the electrical synapse, pre and post synaptic membranes, they are very close to each other. They are having very close proximity. That means they are very close to each other. The presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membranes, they are very close to each other. Okay, that is the first point regarding the electrical synapse. And in the electrical synapses, the electrical current, it will directly flow from the presynaptic membrane to the postsynaptic membrane. Okay, the electrical current will flow from one neuron to the other neuron directly. So the next point is the electrical current, it will flow from one neuron to the other. Okay, the electrical current, in how the impulses are transmitted? Through the electrical current which is flowing from one neuron to the other neuron. Okay, and this transmission of the impulses in the electrical synapse, the transmission of the impulses in the electrical synapse is very much similar to the transmission of the impulses across the single axon. Students, we have already learned how the impulses are transmitted in the single axon. So, the transmission of the impulses across the electrical synapse is very similar to that of the transmission of the impulses across the single axon. Okay, so the transmission is similar to the transmission across single axon. Okay, the transmission is similar to that of the transmission across the single axon. Okay, and the transmission of the impulses through the electrical synapses is very much faster when compared to chemical synapse. Okay, the transmission of the impulses across the electrical synapse is very much faster when compared to the chemical synapse. So the electrical synapses are faster in conduction of the impulses. They are faster in conduction of the impulses when compared to the chemical synapses. Okay, and finally the last point that we have regarding the electrical synapses is in electrical synapse, I told you, what did I tell? The electrical current is flowing from one neuron to the other neuron. That means the electrical current may flow from a presynaptic neuron into a postsynaptic neuron, or from a postsynaptic neuron into a presynaptic neuron. From a presynaptic neuron to a postsynaptic neuron, or from a postsynaptic neuron to a presynaptic neuron. That means the current can flow in both the directions, from presynaptic to postsynaptic or from postsynaptic to presynaptic. That means in the electrical synapses there is bidirectional conduction of impulses. Okay, so there is bidirectional conduction of impulses. There is bidirectional conduction of impulses across the electrical synapse. Okay, and these electrical synapses, they are very rarely found in the body. They are very rarely found in the body. Okay, this is all about the electrical synapse. Students, this is all what we need to learn regarding the electrical synapse. Once again, I'll just quickly revise what is an electrical synapse. Okay, so we have learned regarding the synapse, and I told you that there are two different types of synapses. They are electrical synapse and chemical synapse. We are learning regarding the electrical synapse. In the electrical synapse, the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane, they are in very close proximity to each other. That means they are not separated by any gap. They are very close to each other. Okay. And in the electrical synapse, the electrical current will flow directly from one neuron to the other neuron. Okay. And the transmission of the impulses between in the electrical synapse is similar to that of the transmission of the impulses across the single axon. Okay, that is the next point. And the conduction of impulses across the electrical synapse is very much faster when compared to the chemical synapse. So it is faster in conduction of impulses when compared to chemical synapse. Okay. Then in electrical synapses there is bidirectional conduction of impulses. That means the impulses can be conducted from a presynaptic neuron into a postsynaptic neuron, or from a postsynaptic neuron into a presynaptic neuron. Okay. And last one is, they are very rarely found in the body. They are very rarely found in the body. Okay. So this is all about the first type of synapse, the electrical synapse. Now we will learn regarding the second type of synapse, that is chemical synapse. Let us now start learning regarding the chemical synapse. Okay. So now we are going to learn regarding the chemical synapse, and I told you that this is the diagram showing the chemical synapse. Okay. So in the chemical synapse, the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane are separated by a fluid-filled space called as synaptic cleft. Okay, in the chemical synapse, the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane are separated by a fluid-filled gap called as synaptic cleft. Okay, so here in the note the difference between the electrical synapses and chemical synapses very clearly, students. In the electrical synapses, the presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons are very close to each other. In the chemical synapse, the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane are separated by a fluid-filled space called as synaptic cleft. So this region is the synaptic cleft. Okay. So now let us learn how the impulses are transmitted across the chemical synapse. First, let me write the point we have discussed here. The pre and postsynaptic membranes are separated by a fluid-filled space. They are separated by a fluid-filled space which is called as synaptic cleft. Okay. Now let us learn how the impulses are transmitted across the chemical synapse. See, in the chemical synapse, the presynaptic neuron in the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron. This is the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron. In the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, there are synaptic vesicles. You can see the synaptic vesicles. These are all the synaptic vesicles. In the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, there are synaptic vesicles. And these synaptic vesicles, they contain chemical signaling molecules called as neurotransmitters. Okay. So, in the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, there are synaptic vesicles. And these synaptic vesicles, they contain the chemical signaling molecules called as neurotransmitters. They are called neurotransmitters. Okay. In the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, the synaptic vesicles are present, and these synaptic vesicles contain chemical signaling molecules called as neurotransmitters. They contain chemical signaling molecules called as neurotransmitters. Okay. These neurotransmitters, how they help in the conduction of impulses, let us learn. See, whenever a nerve impulse is reaching the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, whenever a nerve impulse is reaching axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, then it will cause the synaptic vesicles to move towards the presynaptic membrane. Okay, when the nerve impulses are reaching the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, then see the synaptic the presynaptic membrane and they fuse with the presynaptic membrane and they release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. You can observe the synaptic vesicles. Whenever the nerve impulse is reaching the axon terminal, the synaptic vesicles, they move towards the presynaptic membrane and they release their secretions into the synaptic cleft. Now, when the neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft, these neurotransmitters, they will bind with the receptors. These are all the receptors. Okay. When the neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft, then the neurotransmitters, they will bind with the receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. Okay. And the neurotransmitters will bind with the receptors present on the postsynaptic membrane. Okay. I'll just write whatever we have discussed here. I'll just write it in the points. See. Whenever nerve impulse is reaching axon terminal, then synaptic vesicles, they fuse with the presynaptic membrane. They fuse with presynaptic membrane and they release neurotransmitters. Okay. And these neurotransmitters, they will bind with the receptors. They will bind with the receptors which are present on the postsynaptic membrane. Okay. So, whenever the nerve impulse is reaching the axon terminal, the synaptic vesicles, they move towards the presynaptic membrane, fuse with it and release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. These neurotransmitters, they are binding with the receptors. Once the neurotransmitters are binding with the receptors, then they cause the ion channels to open. They cause the ion channels in the postsynaptic membranes to open. Okay. Then when the neurotransmitters are binding with the receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, then they cause the ion channels in the postsynaptic membrane to open. Okay. When the ion channels in the postsynaptic membrane are opening, then the nerve impulse will be generated even in the postsynaptic neuron. Then the nerve impulse is generated even in the postsynaptic neuron. Okay. When the ion channels are opening in the postsynaptic membrane, then the nerve impulse is generated. Nerve impulse is generated even in the postsynaptic neuron. In the postsynaptic neuron also the nerve impulse is generated. So that means the nerve impulse from the presynaptic neuron has travelled into the postsynaptic neuron. Okay. So when the nerve impulse is generated in the postsynaptic neuron, that nerve impulse, it could be an excitatory nerve impulse or it could be an inhibitory nerve impulse. So whatever the nerve impulse which is generated in the postsynaptic neuron, it could be an excitatory nerve impulse or it could be inhibitory nerve impulse. Okay. It could be excitatory nerve impulse or it could be inhibitory nerve impulse. If it's an excitatory nerve impulse, then the postsynaptic neuron will conduct the impulses into the next neuron. If it's an inhibitory nerve impulse, then the nerve impulse will end within the postsynaptic neuron only. Okay. If it's an excitatory nerve impulse, it will be conducted into the further neurons. If it is an inhibitory nerve impulse, the impulse will stop inside the postsynaptic neuron itself. Okay. This is about the chemical synapse. Once again, I'll just quickly revise what is a chemical synapse. See, in the second type of synapses we are learning is the chemical synapse, isn't it? So the chemical synapse, the pre and post synaptic membranes, they are separated by a fluid-filled space called as synaptic cleft. You can observe the parts here. This is the presynaptic membrane, this is the synaptic cleft, and this is the postsynaptic membrane. Okay. And in the chemical synapse, whenever the nerve impulse is reaching the axon terminal, then because of the nerve impulse reaching the axon terminal, the synaptic vesicles present in the axon terminal will move towards the presynaptic membrane. They fuse with the presynaptic membrane and the synaptic vesicles release the chemical signaling molecules called as neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. Okay, when the neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft, then the receptors present in the postsynaptic membrane will bind with the neurotransmitters. When the receptors are binding with the neurotransmitters, then the ion channels in the postsynaptic membrane will also open. As a result, the nerve impulse is generated even in the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so that means the nerve impulse is being conducted from the presynaptic neuron into the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so this nerve impulse, it could be an excitatory nerve impulse or it could be an inhibitory nerve impulse. If it is an excitatory nerve impulse, the nerve impulse from the postsynaptic neuron will be conducted into the next neurons. If it is an inhibitory nerve impulse, then the nerve impulse will be stopped within the postsynaptic neuron itself. Okay, so this is all we have discussed regarding the transmission of nerve impulse. We have studied in this topic, to say in brief, we have studied that the nerve impulse is transmitted from one neuron to the other neuron through synapses. These are of two types. Electrical synapse, in which the conduction of the impulses is through electrical current. The transmission is similar to that of transmission of the impulses across the single axon. And the transmission of impulses in electrical synapses is very faster than compared to chemical synapse. Coming to the chemical synapse, we have studied that in the chemical synapses, the transmission of the impulses is due to the chemical signaling molecules called neurotransmitters. Okay, neurotransmitters that cause the transmission of the impulses from one neuron to the next neuron, from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, this is all about the transmission of nerve impulse. Okay, so students, this was all about the topic transmission of nerve impulse. This is all about this today's topic, and I'll meet you again with the next topic related to neural control and coordination in the next class. Thank you all students for joining the class. I'll see you again in the next class. If you like this class, you please click the like button.